I realized before a field can be plowed, there's a lot of prep work. There are rocks and stumps have to be removed. And this is a couple of years after I had gone through my weekend. I went back to that weekend and thought, I think the Crucible weekend can be the dynamite that blows rocks and stumps out of the way so that the plowing can be done.
Welcome to the Crucible Project Podcast. The Crucible Project is a nonprofit organization committed to creating a world of men and women who live with integrity, grace, and courage, helping them to fulfill their God-given purpose. This podcast will discuss important and sometimes difficult topics while delivering practical life applications with men and women who are currently practicing this work. We are igniting Christ-like change in men and women through experiences of radical honesty and grace.
Hello and welcome to the Crucible Project Podcast. My name is Tim Rush, and today we are talking about leadership with one of our leaders, Barry Thomas. Barry, first, is there anything that our listeners need to know about you as we start this conversation?
First of all, I'm honored to be here. I went on my initial weekend in August of 2005. So this coming August will be 20 years since I was introduced to this work that the Crucible Project does.
So one thing that I love about doing this podcast is I want to know how to be a better leader. And so this is a very selfish motivation for me to get to sit with really good leaders and ask them questions about their story. There's something about stories that help me assimilate the information. So one of the things that I want to say about Barry before we start, about Crucible, is that the leaders are not cookie cutter replications of each other. They are unique individuals, which is good for me to see. Different men leading in different ways. And I have to say about Barry Thomas that he is one of the nicest men you will ever meet. And it seems like in this culture, nice and leader doesn't always go together. But man, Barry, you are a top-notch leader while being one of the nicest men that I know.
Thank you, Tim. I appreciate that.
One thing that's true about Barry, if you have attended a Crucible weekend anywhere outside of Chicago, you should tell Barry thank you. This was a Chicagoland retreat until Barry said, hey, I want to take this to Texas. And from there, it's gone around the world. Tell us what that was like to say, this amazing thing, I think it should move out of Chicago.
So I went on my initial weekend, August 2005. 9 months after that, I moved to Texas. And I was on staff at a church, and I was responsible for really the spiritual formation of our church. I was an associate minister on staff. And that primarily meant I was in charge of our small group ministry, our adult Bible classes. The weekend that I went on 2005 was the most transformational single point event, that I'd ever had in my life. And I was already doing some internal work on my own journey outside of Crucible work. And so it complemented it very well. So I get to this church, and I felt like my job was to help create a developmental culture in this church. And I actually had this vision of my job was to plow a field, and I was showing up with my plow, and plowing this field was cultivating the land for God to do some transformational work at a deeper level in that church. Part of that was starting to include emotional health in our spiritual discipleship. And when I started talking about emotional health, I got blank stares, like it was not registering with anybody. And I realized before a field can be plowed, there's a lot of prep work. There are rocks and stumps have to be removed. And this is a couple of years after I had gone through my weekend. I went back to that weekend and thought, I think the Crucible weekend can be the dynamite that blows rocks and stumps out of the way so that the plowing can be done. So I made a call to Greg Houston, who was the director. Back then, it wasn't the Crucible Project. It was called Dare to Soar, and started talking to him and said, hey, what would it take to get this weekend in Texas? So we started this conversation and said, hey, here are some things that need to happen. And so I recruited some people to help. I raised some money and resources, recruited a team, and they had to go to Chicago to go through weekends so that we could staff our first weekend. And then January of 2009 is when we had the first weekend in Texas. And we had no idea how that was going to go. It felt like just a big risk. And it was amazing, and it worked. And at the end of that weekend, I told our staff, I said, I think we're starting a wildfire that's going to spread. And that's exactly what happened. It started spreading from there, and now, as you mentioned, it's not just across the U.S. It's really around the world.
Yeah, I believe like my experience in Mexico was influenced by one of your cohorts there in Texas that knew my friends in Mexico. And when they said, hey,
Yeah.
we need to do something for men in Mexico, he said, well, you need to come to the Crucible Project. And so it lit a wildfire in Mexico.
Exactly.
And of course, now in Australia, all across central U.S. to the East Coast and into Africa.
And it has been the most rewarding thing in my life. Other than my kids growing up being full-fledged adults, it has been this work. And it's the life-changing work on an individual basis, but then how fruitful it is and how it's spread and multiplied around the world has been very rewarding to watch.
Man, I wish we would have had this conversation 10 years ago. But is there anything like bringing this into a church? Because I don't think you were thinking Texas at the time. You were thinking your people in West Texas.
Yeah.
Looking back, are there things that you go, man, we did that right? Are there things that you look back and go, ooh, if we had a do-over, I would change?
Yeah. Good question. So originally, I thought this would be a great men's ministry at my church. And as we started working towards that first weekend, I realized, no, this needs to be something outside of our church, and never regretted that move. I think that was the right move to not try to make it a ministry at our church, that to make it independent of that. So early on, and for years, we weren't real clear on how this was going to walk out with the Crucible Project. Were we going to start our own weekend? And Greg Houston said, hey, I want us to stay connected. Let's keep these Crucible weekends. And that was the right thing. I think we could have gotten clearer on what that relationship looked like, but we were just stepping into the unknown and making it up as we went. We valued our relationship enough to stay together, even when a lot of the administrative and logistical things were fuzzy.
When you started saying, hey, we need to bring this into Texas, this needs to be something available to your church, did you have any sense, any voice that was saying, yeah, but not you, Barry?
That's a great question, and that might normally be the case. But in this case, I was so clear on what I was trying to accomplish. And that's part of the leadership lesson. I was crystal clear on what we were trying to accomplish, and I was jumping through hoops to make that happen.
So in general, do you have a voice that comes online that tells you to be careful, or any sort of warning about stepping into big projects like this?
So I love creating new things and helping build things. Leadership-wise, that's when I'm at my best. I think the shadow part are the little messages of just believing in myself, and I tend to undersell the influence that I have, or I hate to use the word authority, but the authority that I have in some places.
So what was the unique setting here? Was it the vision was just so big, or was it wasn't a matter of authority? Like what was happening that you were stepping into your power in this situation?
Having a crystal clear vision and what I was trying to accomplish. And when I say what I was trying to accomplish, in so many ways, I feel like God was calling me to it. And I wasn't using that terminology, but he was calling me through this vision of, I'm here to plow this field, and I'm going to use dynamite if that's what it takes to blow rocks and stumps out of the way, because I felt like that's what God was calling me to. My goal was to build a culture in my church, and the Crucible Project was a vehicle to help make that happen.
So were you pretty strategic in choosing the team that you wanted to join you on that journey?
So I was, and then I learned not to be picky and choosy, in the sense that I just cast the vision of what I was trying to do, and whoever expressed interest, hop on this train because here's where we're going. Their openness to the work was really what was most important, and I was just whoever I could get to go.
Yeah, it makes sense. There's a financial investment to begin with, and then there's time. It's a big investment to step into.
And part of that, Tim, was I was just saying, my job is to cast the vision, and God's going to bring the people and get them on board that want to be on board. Similar to inviting a man to a weekend. My job is to make the ask, and then if they're ready and willing, they'll hop on board. If not, we'll catch them another time.
So is there anything that you learned about yourself through your Crucible weekend experience and then bringing this in for your church that shows up in your family life or in your work life?
Yeah, good question. I think about somebody who has this balance between tenderness and this strength. And that those are not mutually exclusive. And I feel like God's called me to embody that balance, learning how to love people that way. And so with my family, it's learning to love them and accept them where they're at, but also, be able to speak the truth in love or hold healthy boundaries when needed and just hold that ground. And so being able to hold that in balance.
That's really cool. So Barry, looking back on your history, when did you realize that you were a leader? What was happening that first time that you turned around and you noticed, hey, people are following me?
Probably the first time I was really aware of it was as far back as junior high. There was a teacher who encouraged me to run for student council officer, and you had to make a speech in front of the student body to do it. And I was just surprised at the response from the students. They actually noticed me or liked me or, whatever. And I just hadn't thought about it. Up until that point, is like, I just do my thing. I play sports. I have fun with my friends and didn't think about my influence on other people and trying to leverage that in healthy ways and good ways. But all of a sudden there was this awareness. It's like, oh, people notice me or are watching. So the officers went that summer to a leadership camp and got exposed to this concept of leadership and teaching about leading. And ever since that time have just loved learning about leadership. I love leading and I love teaching about leadership. And it really started back from that time in junior high.
So when you look back on that junior high boy, is there something that out of the box you can see he was doing this well?
I didn't try to pretend to be somebody I wasn't. And so I think just the authenticity, I was just me, and people appreciate that. I think also just have always learned to respect everyone. So I think people recognize how I treat them, how I treat others, and they're watching that. And it's something that I don't try to do, but I think I have a way of people feeling value, just listening to them, recognizing, remembering their names, remembering things about them. People appreciate that. And it comes from an authentic place, not I'm trying to get something out of you kind of place.
Right. So when you look back, is there anything that this was a growth edge? This is something that I had to learn how to do. And then once you learned how did you improve?
There's lots of growth edges along the way. In high school, just having to learn to lead in adversity. Had some coaching changes and leadership changes. And I was in student government. I was student body president my senior year. And the sponsor that I was really close to stepped down from being the sponsor my senior year. And so somebody that I was looking forward to leading with and working with, she was gone. And so really had to step up into a void. And so learned that I can't always depend on the people that I want to be there.
So that makes me curious. Has that been a pattern that you've seen replay itself?
It has. I'm trying not to take it personal, but I got an engineering degree and I was in engineering industry. And then I left that job and went into full-time ministry. And so the person that hired me into ministry was very well liked. Well, he left 6 months after I got there. And then he went to another church and I ended up working at that church. And then he left a couple years after that. So I'm on staff. Both times he resigned from a church, So I'm trying not to take that personally. But I've learned, number one, not jump into a leadership role just to work with somebody. Number two, how to step up in leadership vacuums and provide leadership in a void when somebody leaves.
So let me ask you one more question. When you look back at 2005 Barry, already doing some work, stepping into the Crucible Project, which I imagine is like the work you were doing accelerated quite a bit. I want to ask, what advice would you have for that man? But maybe it's a blessing. What is it that you would want to say to that version of yourself?
I would tell the 2005 version of me, believe in yourself. Believe in yourself. And that sounds easy to do, but being in this work for so long and helping men in this work, I think it really is, be aware of those negative messages. What are they telling you? And then at that point, I have a choice whether to believe them or not, or what is true about me instead of those lies, because I believe those are lies that Satan wants me to believe. Yeah. And so believing in myself means being aware of those messages when they're playing. What are those messages? And reminding myself what's true of me.
Well, thank you very much for sharing that. When you say it, that sounds so simple. pay attention to those messages. But man, they seem to creep in. And I guess because they happen in our own voices, we don't even realize what's happening.
We all have them. We all have them. And so being aware of them starts giving us some power and control over them versus them controlling us.
And just realizing we can make choices. Once they start coming online, there is something that we can do about them. Seriously, you are one of the kindest leaders I know, and it is just always a pleasure to get to visit with you. So thank you for unpacking a little bit of your story with us.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Crucible World, for being a part of this podcast. We hope that your day is blessed.
For more information about our weekends, please go to thecrucibleproject.org. Or if you're ready to get started on your transformational journey right now, you can connect with one of our Crucible certified coaches for a free 30-minute session at thecrucibleproject.org/coaching. That's thecrucibleproject.org/coaching. If you like what you heard, connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Rate and review wherever you are listening, and don't forget to subscribe on your preferred podcast platform. Thank you for listening.